Chapter 28. An hour later, Schmucke saw Madame Sauvage come into the room, followed by another man in a suit of black, a workman to all appearance. "Cantinet has been so obliging as to send this gentleman, sir," she said. "He is coffin-maker to the parish." The coffin-maker made his bow with a sympathetic and compassionate air, but none the less he had a business-like look, and seemed to know that he was indispensable. He turned an expert's eye upon the dead. "How does the gentleman wish it to be made? Deal, plain oak, or oak lead-lined? Oak with a lead lining is the best style. The body is a stock size." He felt for the feet, and proceeded to take the measure. 1 meter 70, he added. "You will be thinking of ordering the funeral service at the church, sir, no doubt?" Schmucke looked at him as a dangerous madman might look before striking a blow. La Sauvage put in a word. "You ought to find somebody to look after all these things," she said. "Yes," the victim murmured at length. "Shall I fetch Monsieur Tabareau? For you will have a good deal on your hands before long. Monsieur Tabareau is the most honest man in the quarter, you see." "Yes, Monsieur Tabareau. Somebody was speaking of him just now," said Schmucke, completely beaten. "Very well. You can be quiet, sir, and give yourself up to grief when you have seen your deputy." It was nearly 2 o'clock when Monsieur Tabareau's head clerk, a young man who aimed at a bailiff's career, modestly presented himself. Youth has wonderful privileges. No one is alarmed by youth. This young man, Villemot by name, sat down by Schmucke's side and waited his opportunity to speak. His diffidence touched Schmucke very much. "I am Monsieur Tabareau's head clerk, sir," he said. "He sent me here to take charge of your interests and to superintend the funeral arrangements. Is this your wish?" "You cannot save my life. I have not long to live, but you will leave me in peace." "Oh, you shall not be disturbed," said Villemot. "Ver gut. What must I do for dat?" "Sign this paper appointing Monsieur Tabareau to act for you in all matters relating to the settlement of the affairs of the deceased." "Good, give it to me," said Schmucke, anxious only to sign it at once. "No, I must read it over to you first." "Read it over." Schmucke paid not the slightest attention to the reading of the power of attorney, but he set his name to it. The young clerk took Schmucke's orders for the funeral, the interment, and the burial service, undertaking that he should not be troubled again in any way, nor asked for money. "I would give all that I have to be left in peace," said the unhappy man, and once more he knelt beside the dead body of his friend. Fraisier had triumphed. Villemot and La Sauvage completed the circle which he had traced about Pons' heir. There is no sorrow that sleep cannot overcome. Towards the end of the day, La Sauvage, coming in, found Schmucke stretched asleep at the bed-foot. She carried him off, put him to bed, tucked him in maternally, and till the morning Schmucke slept. When he awoke, or rather when the truce was over and he again became conscious of his sorrows, Pons' coffin lay under the gateway in such a state as a third-class funeral may claim, and Schmucke, seeking vainly for his friend, wandered from room to room across vast spaces, as it seemed to him, empty of everything save hideous memories. La Sauvage took him in hand, much as a nurse manages a child. She made him take his breakfast before starting for the church, and while the poor sufferer forced himself to eat, she discovered, with lamentations worthy of Jeremiah, that he had not a black coat in his possession. La Cibot took entire charge of his wardrobe. Since Pons fell ill, his apparel, like his dinner, had been reduced to the lowest terms, to a couple of coats and 2 pairs of trousers. "And you are going just as you are to Monsieur Pons' funeral? It is an unheard of thing. The whole quarter will cry shame upon us." "Und how will you dat I go?" "Why, in mourning." "Mourning?" "It is the proper thing." "Der proper thing! Confound all this stupid nonsense!" cried poor Schmucke. driven to the last degree of exasperation which a childlike soul can reach under stress of sorrow. "Why, the man is a monster of ingratitude," said La Sauvage, turning to a personage who just then appeared. At the sight of this functionary, Schmucke shuddered. The newcomer wore a splendid suit of black knee breeches, black silk stockings, a pair of white cuffs, an extremely correct white muslin tie, and white gloves. A silver chain with a coin attached ornamented his person. A typical official, stamped with the official expression of decorous gloom, an ebony wand in his hand by way of insignia of office, he stood waiting with a three-cornered hat adorned with the tricolour cockade under his arm. "I am the master of the ceremonies," this person remarked in a subdued voice. Accustomed daily to superintend funerals, to move among families plunged in one and the same kind of tribulation, real or feigned, this man, like the rest of his fraternity, spoke in hushed and soothing tones. He was decorous, polished, and formal, like an allegorical stone figure of death. Schmucke quivered through every nerve, as if he were confronting his executioner. "Is this gentleman the son, brother, or father of the deceased?" inquired the official. "I am all that and more besides. I am his friend," said Schmucke, through a torrent of weeping. "Are you his heir?" "Heir," repeated Schmucke. "Nothing matters to me more in this world," returning to his attitude of hopeless sorrow. "Where are the relatives, the friends?" asked the master of the ceremonies. "All here," exclaimed the German, indicating the pictures and rarities. "Not one of dem have ever given bane to mine Bourbons. Here is everydings dot he loved, after me." Schmucke had taken his seat again, and looked as vacant as before. He dried his eyes mechanically. Villemot came up at that moment. He had ordered the funeral, and the master of the ceremonies, recognizing him, made an appeal to the newcomer. "Well, sir, it is time to start. The hearse is here, but I have not often seen such a funeral as this. Where are the relatives and friends?" "We have been pressed for time," replied Villemot. "This gentleman was in such deep grief that he could think of nothing, and there is only one relative." The master of the ceremonies looked compassionately at Schmucke. This expert in sorrow knew real grief when he saw it. He went across to him. "Come, take heart, my dear sir. Think of paying honor to your friend's memory." "We forgot to send out cards, but I took care to send a special message to Monsieur le Président de Marville, the one relative that I mentioned to you. There are no friends. Monsieur Pons was conductor of an orchestra at a theatre, but I do not think that anyone will come. This gentleman is the universal legatee, I believe." "Then he ought to be chief mourner," said the master of the ceremonies. "Have you a black coat?" he continued, noticing Schmucke's costume. "I am all in black inside," poor Schmucke replied in heartrending tones. "So black it is dot I feel death in me. God in heaven is going to have pity upon me. He will send me to mine friend in der grave, and I dank him for it." He clasped his hands. "I have told our management before now that we ought to have a wardrobe department and lend the proper mourning costumes on hire," said the master of the ceremonies, addressing Villemot. "It is a want that is more and more felt every day, and we have even now introduced improvements. But as this gentleman is chief mourner, he ought to wear a cloak, and this one that I have brought with me will cover him from head to foot. No one need know that he is not in proper mourning costume. Will you be so kind as to rise?" Schmucke rose, but he tottered on his feet. "Support him," said the master of the ceremonies, turning to Villemot. "You are his legal representative." Villemot held Schmucke's arm while the master of the ceremonies invested Schmucke with the ample, dismal-looking garment worn by heirs at law in the procession to and from the house and the church. He tied the black silken cords under the chin, and Schmucke, as heir, was in full dress. And now comes a great difficulty. continued the master of the ceremonies. "We want 4 bearers for the pall. If nobody comes to the funeral, who is to fill the corners? It is 10:30 already," he added, looking at his watch. "They are waiting for us at the church." "Oh, here comes Fraisier!" Villemot exclaimed, very imprudently, but there was no one to hear the tacit confession of complicity. "Who is this gentleman?" inquired the master of the ceremonies. "Oh, he comes on behalf of the family." "Whose family?" "The disinherited family. He is Monsieur Camusot de Marville's representative." "Good," said the master of the ceremonies with a satisfied air. "We shall have 2 pall-bearers, at any rate, you and he." And, happy to find 2 of the places filled up, he took out some wonderful white buckskin gloves and politely presented Fraisier and Villemot with a pair apiece. "If you gentlemen will be so good as to act as pall-bearers," said he. Fraisier, in black from head to foot, pretentiously dressed, with his white tie and official air, was a sight to shudder at. He embodied 100 briefs. "Willingly, sir," said he. "If only 2 more persons will come, the 4 corners will be filled up," said the master of the ceremonies. At that very moment, the indefatigable representative of the firm of Sonnet came up, and, closely following him, the man who remembered Pons and thought of paying him a last tribute of respect. This was a supernumerary at the theatre, the man who put out the scores on the music stands for the orchestra. Pons had been wont to give him a 5-franc piece once a month, knowing that he had a wife and family. "Oh, Dobinard!" "Topinard!" Schmucke cried out at the sight of him. "You love Pons!" "Why, I have come to ask news of Monsieur Pons every morning, sir." "Every morning, poor Dobinard!" And Schmucke squeezed the man's hand. "But they took me for a relation, no doubt, and did not like my visits at all. I told them that I belonged to the theatre and came to inquire after Monsieur Pons, but it was no good. They saw through that dodge, they said. I asked to see the poor dear man, but they never would let me come upstairs." "Dat abominable Zipod!" said Schmucke, squeezing Topinard's horny hand to his heart. "He was the best of men, that good Monsieur Pons. Every month he used to give me 5 francs. He knew that I had 3 children and a wife. My wife has gone to the church." "I shall divide mein pred mit you," cried Schmucke, in his joy at finding at his side some one who loved Pons. "If this gentleman will take a corner of the pall, we shall have all 4 filled up," said the master of the ceremonies. There had been no difficulty over persuading the agent for monuments. He took a corner the more readily when he was shown the handsome pair of gloves which, according to custom, was to be his property. "11:15. We absolutely must go down. They are waiting for us at the church." The 6 persons thus assembled went down the staircase. The cold-blooded lawyer remained a moment to speak to the 2 women on the landing. "Stop here and let nobody come in," he said, "especially if you wish to remain in charge, Madame Cantinet. Aha, 2 francs a day, you know." By a coincidence in no wise extraordinary in Paris, 2 hearses were waiting at the door, and 2 coffins standing under the archway. Cibot's funeral, and the solitary state in which Pons was lying, was made even more striking in the street. Schmucke was the only mourner that followed Pons's coffin. Schmucke, supported by one of the undertaker's men, for he tottered at every step. From the Rue de Normandie to the Rue d'Orléans and the Church of Saint François, the 2 funerals went between a double row of curious onlookers. For everything, as was said before, makes a sensation in the quarter. Everyone remarked the splendor of the white funeral car with a big embroidered P suspended on a hatchment, and the one solitary mourner behind it; while the cheap beer that came after it was followed by an immense crowd. Happily, Schmucke was so bewildered by the throng of idlers and the rows of heads in the windows that he heard no remarks, and only saw the faces through a mist of tears. "Oh, it is the Nutcracker," said one. "The musician, you know." "Who can the pall-bearers be?" "Pooh! Play actors." "I say, just look at poor old Cibot's funeral. There is one worker the less. What a man! He could never get enough of work." "He never went out." "He never kept Saint Monday." "How fond he was of his wife." "Ah, there is an unhappy woman." Remonencq walked behind his victim's coffin. People condoled with him on the loss of his neighbor. The two funerals reached the church. Cantinet and the doorkeeper saw that no beggars troubled Schmucke. Villemot had given his word that Pons' heir should be left in peace. He watched over his client and gave the requisite sums, and Cibot's humble bier, escorted by 60 or 80 persons, drew all the crowd after it to the cemetery. At the church door, Pons' funeral procession mustered 4 mourning coaches, one for the priest and 3 for the relations, but one only was required, for the representative of the firm of Sonnet departed during Mass to give notice to his principal that the funeral was on the way, so that the design for the monument might be ready for the survivor at the gates of the cemetery. A single coach sufficed for Fraisier, Villemot, Schmucke, and Topinard; but the remaining 2, instead of returning to the undertaker, followed in the procession to Père Lachaise. A useless procession, not unfrequently seen. There are always too many coaches when the dead are unknown beyond their own circle, and there is no crowd at the funeral. Dear indeed the dead must have been in their lifetime if relative or friend will go with them so far as the cemetery in this Paris, where everyone would fain have 25 hours in the day. But with the coachmen it is different. They lose their tips if they do not make the journey, so, empty or full, the mourning coaches go to the church and cemetery, and return to the house for gratuities. A death is a sort of drinking fountain for an unimagined crowd of thirsty mortals. The attendants at the church, the poor, the undertaker's men, the drivers and sextons, are creatures like sponges that dip into a hearse and come out again saturated. From the church door, where he was beset with a swarm of beggars, promptly dispersed by the beadle, to Père Lachaise, poor Schmucke went as criminals went in old times from the Palais de Justice to the Place de Grève. It was his own funeral that he followed, clinging to Topinard's hand, to the one living creature besides himself who felt a pang of real regret for Pons' death. As for Topinard, greatly touched by the honor of the request to act as pallbearer, content to drive in a carriage the possessor of a new pair of gloves, it began to dawn upon him that this was to be one of the great days of his life. Schmucke was driven passively along the road, as some unlucky calf is driven in a butcher's cart to the slaughter-house. Fraisier and Villemot sat with their backs to the horses. Now, as those know whose sad fortune it has been to accompany many of their friends to their last resting place, all hypocrisy breaks down in the coach during the journey, often a very long one, from the church to the Eastern Cemetery, to that one of the burying grounds of Paris, in which all vanities, all kinds of display are met, so rich is it in sumptuous monuments. On these occasions, those who feel least begin to talk soonest, and in the end the saddest listen, and their thoughts are diverted. "Monsieur le Président has already started for the court," Fraisier told Villemot, "and I did not think it necessary to tear him away from business. He would have come too late in any case. He is the next of kin, but as he has been disinherited, and Monsieur Schmucke gets everything, I thought that if his legal representative were present, it would be enough." Topinard lent an ear to this. "Who was the queer customer that took the fourth corner?" continued Fraisier. He is an agent for a firm of monumental stonemasons. He would like an order for a tomb, on which he proposes to put 3 sculptured marble figures, music, painting, and sculpture, shedding tears over the deceased." "It is an idea," said Fraisier. "The old gentleman certainly deserved that much, but the monument would cost 700 or 800 francs." "Oh, quite that." "If Monsieur Schmucke gives the order, it cannot affect the estate. You might eat up a whole property with such expenses." "There would be a lawsuit, but you would gain it." "Very well," said Fraisier, "then it will be his affair. It would be a nice practical joke to play upon the monument makers," Fraisier added in Villemot's ear. "For if the will is upset, and I can answer for that, or if there is no will at all, who would pay them?" Villemot grinned like a monkey, and the pair began to talk confidentially, lowering their voices. But the man from the theatre, with his wits and senses sharpened in the world behind the scenes, could guess at the nature of their discourse. In spite of the rumbling of the carriage and other hindrances, he began to understand that these representatives of justice were scheming to plunge poor Schmucke into difficulties. And when at last he heard the ominous word Clichy, the honest and loyal servitor of the stage made up his mind to watch over Pons' friend. At the cemetery, where 3 square yards of ground had been purchased through the good offices of the firm of Sonnet, Villemot having announced Schmucke's intention of erecting a magnificent monument, the master of ceremonies led Schmucke through a curious crowd to the grave into which Pons' coffin was about to be lowered. But here, at the sight of the square hole, the 4 men waiting with ropes to lower the bier, and the clergy saying the last prayer for the dead at the graveside, something clutched tightly at the German's heart. He fainted away. End of chapter 28.